Thanks for joining us. And maybe you might want to start by introducing yourself and the context of Museum of Discovery.
So I'm Kristin Alford. I'm the director of MOD, which is a Museum of Discovery at the University of South Australia. And we are a place that aims to inspire young adults about future careers, essentially. So to use really interesting immersive experiences at the intersection of science, art and innovation to inspire young people to think about the sorts of futures they want to create and the sorts of skill sets they might want to take on board as part of their learning journey. But because my background is as both an engineer and a futurist, I was more interested in using both of those perspectives to think about how we do things within mods. So most things that we do have a grounding in some kind of foresight or futures theory that allows us to really help position that future thinking for our audiences.
Waging Peace, that was probably one of the early shows at the Museum of Discovery. That's how we started talking about our film Trigger Warning.
Yeah, so our second exhibition at MOD at the end of 2018 was called Waging Peace. And it actually came from a project I did during my master's degree in strategic foresight, where I was thinking about the amount of investment that goes into defence spending and wondering about changing our perception around that. So I'd written an essay on looking at peace technologies and what we might invest in if we were investing in peace rather than conflict and defence. So I wanted to have a bit of a critical discussion about exactly what that meant for our state, and to do it in a way that wasn't necessarily anti-defence. I wasn't trying to, minimise the importance of that industry or come at it from a particular political perspective. I just wanted to open it up a little bit to sort of say, well, how might we think about this if we're trying to think about the sort of future we want to create rather than responding to threats. And so Waging Peace came about with the specific objective of saying, how might we aggressively pursue peace? So already that was upsetting to people, because the peace people we spoke to, people who had invested lifetimes in peace, were very put off by this aggressive pursuit.
I mean, it must have been quite challenging. It sounds like it was a very fine line to walk. And we were wondering about how our piece Trigger Warning fitted into that.
There were probably at least three things that made it challenging. The first thing was that we were new. Like when we spoke to you, we hadn't even opened, and so we didn't even know what our spaces looked like. We'd not been into the space. We didn't know how they would feel or what would work. I think the second issue was sort of, at that stage we were still being thought of very much as a science and technology space, and so it wasn't really important for us to engage with defence. But then when you're trying to commission a speculative design piece into a science centre, that's a little bit strange, I think, in terms of the perceived fit. There was appetite for it, but I was conscious of, we wanted to be making those connections back with the piece itself and with the science or the technology that underpinned it. And I think that leads into the futures piece as well. And maybe this was difficult for the opposite reason, but I think by the time we got the film in at the end of 2018, it felt too real. There was this real sense of, when we'd started talking about it, it felt like a speculative future. And then I've watched it so many times, but I keep saying there's always this moment at about 5.5 minutes in where my stomach just starts to churn. And I feel like I'm going to be sick. Like it has this really visceral kind of discomfort for me around that time. And I think it's just the relentless nature of the content. And yeah, that started to feel not so speculative as Waging Peace played out sort of end of 2018, early 2019. So I think for those three reasons, it made it quite a challenging thing to put into the exhibition and into the context that we were working in.
So Trigger Warning is about a 6 to 7 minute short film that is bringing what you might call culture wars and kind of algorithmic fragmentation and this kind of fracturing of identities that we see online into the real world. So in a way, what would it feel like to live in a world physically with these kind of warring factions? You were presenting it or screening it in this exhibition primarily aimed at young people. And so you were watching the film several times when you're taking tours with young people. And just curious, maybe if you want to talk about how it was received.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just to sort of explain how it was staged. We had a dedicated room for it. And as you came in, we had arranged a set of mannequins that were dressed in costumes that were representative of some of those splinter groups, or some of those activist kind of areas, or some of those deep recesses of the internet. And they were really frightening, where you get this feeling that some of those are quite violent. So already you're sort of set with a perspective of this seems very strange and weird. I think just that process of being held up at the start by this sort of sense of something's coming, and then coming into this room to sort of sit and watch the film itself kind of was a different sort of expectation, because it wasn't just the film. You weren't coming in just to watch the film. And so if I think about the sorts of discussions that people had, and again, it's kind of hard to do with a 2022 brain looking back, because, I think some of the things that we were foreshadowing in that film are so live now. And I'm thinking specifically around sort of the anti-vax misinformation clusters of thinking, and I've got friends who are kind of sort of stuck in those rabbit holes at the moment, and you know that it feels very real, and you know that they're basing a lot of their decision making on things that are seeded and false. So I think there was that sense of unease at the time with our young audience, that for them, the warnings that they get about the internet are often around, the classic sort of stranger danger. Yeah, but this was a different sort of thing. This was actually sort of saying, those groups that you might feel close affiliation to and close identity to may not be what they seem. And your friends following those pathways may not get out. I think so. So when we were speaking to young people about it, it was really this sort of sense of, there's something else to be really conscious about. There's something else to really think about. So I think for most people, it was startling and had this real kind of effect of being really uncomfortable. I was nervous that there might be some aspects of that would really appeal to our audience. And that would be familiar and actually exciting in kind of the way that we didn't want it to be. And we didn't get that, as that had been an identified risk, but we didn't get that in the end. I think most of the response to it was very much around this sort of growing sense of the need to be more aware of what was happening, and to open up a space. And it felt very real. It did feel like a documentary, I think, for people in some ways, rather than a near future exploration. It felt like those groups were real, and those people were real, and that those things were actually happening.
It is funny to think back, because it did accelerate very quickly at that point. I remember it went from fringe internet to, I remember you were saying there was articles about posters going up, various sort of terrorist attacks that were kind of linked to some of the groups. It really seemed to sort of came out of the shadows around the time.
And I think, if you look at that time, Trump was in full kind of taking down the system swing. And when we launched it, there wasn't that groundswell. It still did feel a little bit fringe, I think, in some of those aspects. But I think we were able to pick up quite a lot of those threads and talk about misinformation and talk about radicalization. I always think back on it with that slightly nauseous feeling of not being able to detect exactly why I feel so uncomfortable about it. But it just feels like what you've done with trigger warning is identify, these currents of larger change that we're still seeing play out today.
The film is being screened as part of a current show called Subject to Change at the Droog Gallery in Amsterdam. And we also have the mannequins here and the costumes, and people are a bit taken aback. And, there are people who don't know what they stand for. There was a little bit of a dip, but it's kind of come back as a thing that seems to be happening. And we just finished a film last year called The Intersection, which actually builds on top of this work, because we were aware of the extent to which we see the tribalism play out.
Like, as I said, I watched it a lot of times because I was taking people through, and I still look back on it with this kind of sense of dis-ease and feeling sick. But I mean, you must have felt the same making it as well, just kind of doing the research to sort of pull it out.
It was quite eye-opening. A lot of it was us trying to kind of make sense of this world that we'd kind of uncovered. I think we went in, not quite knowing what we were, the journey that we were embarking on.
Seeing inside the underbelly of the internet, there's a whole dark side to it.
I mean, one of the factions of the groups that we found were this eco-fascist, and I had no idea what an eco-fascist was, and it seemed like quite a weird connection of terms like fascism and ecology. So I was kind of a little like, what is this thing?
It was a very intense period. We wanted to leave it behind us for a bit. And so just want to kind of think about, so, you've been doing so many different shows after Waiting Peace, and, where do you feel it's the Museum of Discovery's landed, and, what's keeping you going in terms of, what's exciting you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the show we've got at the moment is called Invisibility, and it is led by artists, whereas a lot of our work is more of a mixture of working with artists and working with researchers and working with creative technologists. So it's a little bit of a different approach. What we're looking at for the future is we're looking at an annual exhibition that each year feels very different to the one that's come before, but that we're always exploring that edge for the future. So at the moment we're exploring an idea for next year, which is all about pushing the boundaries of the body and the mind. We're looking at another project that's looking at impact, immortality and inheritance. And I'm not really sure what that means yet, but sort of looking at some of those existential threats that we might have to life, whether those be, large asteroids hitting us, or whether that be antimicrobial resistance. So the themes in Invisibility are around data privacy, ubiquitous sensing, climate action and social justice. So I think that view sums up really where we've sort of found ourselves or found our feet, really, to be exploring these future issues that are uncertain and trying to unpick them from a range of different perspectives, and to do that in a way that can be playful or it can be intense. But most of all, we want to make sure that people have a sort of a transforming experience. And of course there are a range of really future focused museums that have come into being over the last 5 years as well. And so thinking of ourselves as part of that family of people who are exploring futures with community, and thinking about how we build capability in the community to speculate, to anticipate, to assess, to reject aspects of what's sort of being developed by others, and to be critical about things, I think is a really, well, it feels very meaningful to me to be doing that sort of work with our community here. It's
a very different kind of a museum that you are doing, this kind of very iterative and self-reflexive programming, and I think probably that ties back to the idea of future careers. In a way, you're shaping what young people decide to become, and showing them these kind of breadth of interconnected challenges. It's really,
yeah, I think that interconnected challenges is probably really a really nice way of thinking about it, because those traditional careers like law and medicine, certainly in our younger age groups, they want to be YouTube stars or TikTok stars or those sort of things, and it's like, well, you can do that, and there's actually nothing wrong with any of those careers, but there is a world that sits that you might not be aware of. They all need to be opened up, they all need to be critiqued, they all need to be sort of thought about in different ways, and mostly I just want to leave our young people, and this is why we did Waging Peace as well, thinking about defence. I want to leave them with this sense that the work that they do is meaningful, it has purpose. That's just a recipe for better mental health for starters, but it's also a recipe for creating a better world, and one that has more opportunity to be sustainable and equitable and regenerative and prosperous.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's really, really, really appreciate your time and this conversation. Thank you.